The first thing that we want to do is gather up all of our supplies. And as you can see, I have them all here. I just thought I would go over them quickly. The first thing that you obviously want to have is your pattern. And there is only 3 pattern pieces that you need for this particular pattern. There's a couple more pieces that you can just cut or tear the fabric to size. Now, it is worth mentioning again that once you have your pattern, and I will put a link to the pattern in the description below, you want to download your pattern to a laptop or a desktop computer, not a tablet or a phone. And after that, you want to open the file up in Adobe Reader, not Adobe Preview, and from there you can print your pattern pieces. So I do save it to my computer, and then it's stored somewhere up in a cloud or something, so that I have the ability then to also open it on my iPad. And I love doing that because if there's something that you want to zoom in on the detail, you can do that very easily on a tablet or an iPad, whereas it's a little more difficult on the computer. So I prefer to read my instructions on my iPad, but I will print the pattern from my computer. So you're going to have your pattern. The next thing is fabric. So I have my vinyl here, which I keep on a roll so that it doesn't get creases in it. And then I have my interfacing, which is Pellon 971F. Now you can use whichever interfacing you would like, but this is what I prefer. And as you can see, I buy it in bulk when it's on sale. Then I have my fashion fabric, and I plan to use this for the lining also. But if you do not want to use your fashion fabric for the lining, then you will also need a piece of lining fabric. In addition to that, I have a coordinating piece of fabric that I plan to make piping with. So I've got my cording and I've got my fabric. Now you can use pre-purchased bias, you know, the fold over bias. I prefer to use fabric and make my own because making your own, you're going to have a better quality of fabric than what comes in those packages that you can purchase. But that is only for covering up the seam allowance. So if that's what you prefer to use, that works just fine for that. And then you're going to need a zipper that's 12 inches or longer. This is a 14-inch zipper. You're going to cut it off to size. So if you have a zipper that's longer, don't worry about it. If it matches, hey, use it. Then I have the swivel hooks, the D-rings, and a slider. You definitely want to have a size 18 needle. You're going to be going through a lot of thicknesses when you get to the seam allowances with zippers and everything else. So that's very important. And on that same line of thought, I have a hump jumper that I'll be using. And of course, you're going to want your rotary cutter and a mat and a ruler, obviously matching thread. I will be using just regular all-purpose thread, but if you prefer to use heavy-duty thread, that's also a good option. This is a nifty little tool for making your own bias binding, so I'll be using that for my bias binding to cover the seam allowances. And then you're going to need a marking tool. Now, I thought I had it up here. I recommend a blue washout marker, and that's what I use for most things. Because my fabric is blue, that's not going to work. So I've got here a water erasable white chalk pen by Hemline. And I'll have a link to all of these various supplies in the description below. To mark the vinyl, I'm going to just use a fine point Sharpie. And because we're sewing with vinyl, you're going to want to use clips instead of pins. So I've got my little plastic clips here for that. And then lastly, I do like to use an edge stitching foot. That really helps get your top stitching lines to be really accurate. So that's another tool that we can use. If you have a Teflon foot for your sewing machine, you'll want to use that. I will be making straps from the fashion fabric, but if you prefer to use webbing, you can also use 1-inch webbing for that. I am going to be using the 505 adhesive spray to stick the pieces together to make the quilted gusset. If you're not going to quilt your gusset and you're going to have your lining be loose or floating, whatever you want to call it, you don't need this. And if you don't have this, you can always pin the two pieces together. So, I did not mention, but it does say in your pattern that you will need extra fabric, such as I have, if you're going to be making your own cording, piping, or if you're going to make your own bias tape. It's nice to buy at least a ½ yard because then you won't have as many seams in your bias when you're making those. So that wraps up the supply list, and we will get things cut out and then get to sewing. As you can see, I've got all of my pattern pieces cut out, and I've got the vinyl cut out, and hopefully you can see I have used my little Sharpie and marked the center points that are on the pattern piece for both of those. I have all of my bias, double fold bias tape made. I've got all of my piping made and have trimmed the seam allowance down to the 3/8 of an inch that's needed for the pattern, and then the various pattern pieces. And I want to mention here that, as indicated on the pattern, if you're going to quilt this gusset strip, it's a good idea to cut the fabric an inch wider than the pattern piece, and that's because it can distort or a little bit draw up a little bit when you've quilted it, so having that extra fabric on each side will be helpful. And I've centered the interfacing piece inside of this, and that is worth noting. You want to make sure that you trim off the seam allowance on your interfacing pieces. That will reduce the bulk in the seam allowance, and it'll make it much easier to sew. So with all of the prep work finished, we are ready to sit down at the sewing machine. If you are using 45-inch wide fabric, you are going to need to join 2 strips of fabric here as shown in the instructions on page 2. Place the 2 pieces at a 90-degree angle and then stitch across it just like this picture shows. The reason for doing that is if you just sew straight across, you're going to have the bulk of the seam all in one spot. If you sew them at an angle, like in the picture, you can see that the seam is diagonal, and that way when you make your strap, some of the bulk is here, some of the bulk is here. So you've got your bulk in two different places on the strap, and that is a much better choice than having a seam that goes straight up and down and having all the bulk right here in one spot. So after you've joined the two strips, you want to first press your 4-inch strip of fabric in half. That's step one. And then after you've pressed it in half, you can open it up, and then you will press the cut edges toward so that they meet in the center where that fold is. So that is step two, is to press the ends on the inside, and that will encase these raw edges. And then of course the last step is to press that back together, and here you will have your finished strap and you're ready to start sewing. So I have my edge stitching foot on the machine, and I've bumped the needle over a few positions so that it will stitch exactly off center there. You want to stitch all along one side of the strap, and when that side is finished, then you'll come back and edge stitch along the other side of the strap. After your straps have been stitched on both sides, the next step is to cut a couple short pieces that will be used for the D-rings. I've cut two pieces here that are approximately 2 inches each. You're going to slide the D-ring onto that strap, and then with the edges matched, I'm going to go ahead and stitch across here, and I'm going to go back and forth a couple times just to make sure that this is secure. The next step is to prepare the zipper, and to do that I'm going to cut off both ends so that I get rid of this metal stop at the end. You could use a 12-inch zipper and leave the front and the back end on, and it might be okay, but I like to have the fabric ends. I think it gives a cleaner finish to it, and by doing this it also eliminates having the coils of the zipper end up in the seam allowance, so it's a little bit easier to go through. So then I open the zipper up slightly, and I'm going to cut this so that it's exactly 11 inches long. The next step is to add the tabs to the end of the zipper. So I'm going to take one of the tab pieces that has been cut, and I'm going to kind of center the zipper on it. It will extend a little bit past the zipper on each side, and you can clip these or pin these. For the tail end of the zipper, you don't really need to do either of that. And then you're just going to sew across with a 3/8 inch seam allowance. When you get to the coils, you may want to hand crank as you go across the coils just to make sure you don't break a needle. With such a large needle on, that's typically not a problem, but I feel like it's not worth taking a chance over. Then you can press both of the tabs back away from the zipper, both the lining as well as the upper tab, and then you want to put your tabs on the other side of the zipper as well. And so you want to butt the two zipper coils together here, and I do like to pin those. You can clip or pin, but I like to make sure that they're not going to shift while it's under the foot of the machine. So pin those together and then place the other portion of the tab on top, and again you're going to stitch this with a 3/8 inch seam allowance and hand crank across the coils. And then you'll press these away from the zipper as well. And you can see then when you close this up, you have such a nice finish here. The next step after that is to stitch close to the edge, the folded edge here of the zipper. If you want, you can switch to an edge stitching foot if that makes it easier for you. Or just keep it lined up nice and evenly with your regular foot on. Once these are on, you can go ahead and trim away the excess fabric that is on the side of each zipper. And these probably don't need to be this long. Okay, do that to both ends. And now your zipper is ready. To sew the zipper on, you want to take the right side of the lining piece and put the wrong side of the zipper to the right side of the lining piece. And then you're going to stitch at 1/4 inch seam allowance. I start with the zipper open, and then when you get to the tab, you're going to want to close it and finish stitching that way. You also want to make sure that you know exactly where 1/4 inch is before you start. Okay, so I've got this stitched. You also want to make sure that the tab extensions are evenly distributed on the outside edges. Once that is finished, you need to apply the fashion fabric. And I've got the same fabric for the lining and the fashion fabric, so they look identical, but if you didn't have the same fabric, these would be right sides together. And you want to make sure that you are using the side that has the 1/4 inch seam allowance on the top, because you've got a 1/4 inch seam allowance here and a 3/8 inch seam allowance here. So you're going to do the same thing. You're going to pin the fashion fabric to the right side of the zipper. So you've got the right side of the zipper, the right side of the fashion fabric. You're going to pin this together and then stitch it again from this side so that you can use your previous row of stitching as a guide. When you stitch the second side, you want to make sure that you're getting one thread closer to the zipper coils than you did when you stitched the lining on, and that will hide this first row of stitching. Okay, so this side of the zipper is finished. Now you want to do the same thing to the other side. Once both sides have been attached, you can go ahead and trim this extra tab piece off the top so that the edges are even. Then I'm going to take it to the iron and I'm going to press it both from the front side as well as from the back side to make sure it's out of the way of the zipper, and then I'm going to come back and edge stitch. Now I'm ready to edge stitch next to the folded edge where the seam line is for the zipper. So my edge stitching is complete, and before I go any further, it's always a wise idea to double check the width of your zipper block and compare it to the width of your gusset, because they need to be exactly the same. And as you can see, mine is slightly off, so I'm going to trim the outside edges. I'll take 1/8 of an inch off each side so that they match exactly. This is very, it's not uncommon for this to happen because it depends how closely you stitch the fabric to the zipper, but it's better to have it slightly wide so it can be trimmed down than to have it be too narrow. So I trimmed a little bit off each side, and now you can see these match up. So the next step is going to be just to baste the outside edges together on the zipper block. The outer edges are basted, and now I am going to attach my D-rings to each end of the zipper block. And you just want to make sure that they're centered over the zipper area. And go ahead and stitch those on at about 1/4 of an inch seam allowance.